Hi guys, Z here. You know what I love the most in this game? Absolutely nothing anymore, because this game has just become an absolute mess over the course of the past 3 years. Thank you, comment section from the last video. Okay, but on a more serious note, and something that I actually think, I like seeing a lot of the newer skills that get added every book. Some tend to just be variants of older skills, sometimes, they just kind of exist, and a lot of other times, especially as of late, they tend to be new releases or upgraded tier 4 variants of older skills that completely reinvent the skill. Except Attack, Defense, Scout. That one just, that one kind of exists. It's really the most nothing tier 4 skill ever. It keeps the game a lot more fresh. In theory. You see, over the past several months, they've been really gung-ho about not only releasing an upgraded tier 4 skill or a brand new one entirely, but then introducing arguably better versions of them barely 3 months later, and it's getting really tiring if I'm gonna be real with y'all. I think many people, including myself, really took notice with it all with Endless Tempest and Brutal Tempest. Brave Felix released with the former in August of last year, and then only 5 months later, they introduced an arguably stronger version of the skill on Legendary Ira in January of this year. It essentially traded out the Nullify Foes bonus effect for Canto Distance, which was a considerable upgrade since the former is so much easier to get outsourced. And you could argue that 5 months is a good amount of time between the upgrades, which, maybe I could get behind in some cases. So let's talk about the Lookout skills for a second. Lookout Force released at the end of last year on Rearmed Layla, a brand new tier 4 skill that granted Canto 2, after action ally swapping, attack and speed penalty nullification, and some stats during combat. Fast forward only 2 months, we get Active Lookout on Aided Yunaka, which is the same skill except, in a similar case to the Tempest skills, swaps out one effect for arguably a stronger one. In this case being the attack and speed penalty nullification effect for Desperation. I definitely think this is a lot more egregious comparatively to the Tempest skill, since it's barely even had any time to breathe before they decided to release a newer, arguably stronger alternative option. Layla didn't even rerun before they decided to move on with it, which was kinda nuts, honestly. That said, it is worth noting that not all of the newer skills are strictly better per se. Most of the time they are, but still, even just going by the new Tempest skill we got on the summer banner, that's more of a side grade at best, and that skill isn't even that bad either. But that also falls into another issue I have with modern skill releases as of late. At least upgrading a skill is not as bad as introducing an entirely new skill and then merging it into something entirely better barely 3 months later, which, funnily enough, assuming that's your type of humor, is what the new Tempest skill falls into as well. Pulse Tempest F is a combination of Pulse on Blades, a skill released roughly 3 to 4 months ago, and Tempest, which, similarly to that of Lookout, is just a strictly better version of Pulse on Blades for anybody that can use it. Granted, it does have slightly more restrictions than Pulse on Blades, but it's still a notable upgrade nonetheless. And this isn't even the only skill this happened to. We just got Assault Force back in January on Desert Marissa, and 4 months later, it's now merged into Potent Assault. The difference between those two being the penalty neutralization effect from the former, now granting an additional attack from the latter. That's pretty ridiculous. I feel like these combined skills suffer a lot more than any of the newer tier 4 skills, because at least with the tier 4 upgrades, you could argue that the stuff that came before it really wasn't good enough. With the combined skills, however, it's releasing very strong skills and then making them even stronger after barely any time has passed. Sometimes they also just have entirely different prerequisites too, which makes obtaining them even more difficult. Like, tell me why the prerequisite skill for Assault Force is Flow Force 3, and the prerequisite for Potent Assault is Flow Refresh 3. How does that work? I still think my favorite of the upgrades we've had this year was Attack Res Discord releasing in January into Attack Res Havoc in April, which is so much stronger than the former than it really has any right to be despite being 3 months apart. Discord penalty versus Sabotage, Schism, Canto 1, and better true damage scaling is a massive jump for 3 months time. Part of the reason why I think it feels a lot worse is because of the homogenization issue a lot of the game has had for a while. Even with so many new skills in the game, a lot of units end up sticking with 1 to 2 specific skills because of how overtly dominant they are over a lot of their contemporaries. So when they keep making skills that end up becoming the best in slot for a majority of the units in a specific archetype, it keeps reinforcing homogenization, and in turn, the problems with how quickly these skill upgrades release. The one out I could potentially give if they were to do it is if they released enough types of skills that not only stood on equal footing, but were also different enough to the point where you didn't necessarily have to think about upgrading much faster than you you'd want to. I really do think homogenization does play a big role in it, all because everyone running the same 1 or 2 skills currently doesn't really leave a lot of room for much else. And the thing is, it's not like making these types of skills is inherently bad by any means. I'm not even against the idea of combining skills or releasing upgrades, but they were usually paced out so much better before. We had similar upgrades this year too with Potent Finish, and you know, the difference between that skill and the other ones previously mentioned is that Potent was over a year old by the point this upgrade came out, which is a lot more reasonable. Same thing with skills like Perfect Attack Speed Insight Hone, Assault Rush, Speed Res Low Finish, and so on. Really, if the pacing of these upgrades were a lot more reasonable, then I don't think most people would have a lot of issues with them. A lot of the pacing when it comes to skill releases and upgrades in the past were a lot slower, to the point where you could get away with an older skill for a lot longer. Sometimes the jump would be a lot more noticeable, and that was expected because of skill creep. This wasn't a new phenomenon with the game whatsoever, but it's ramped up so much this year alone that it really feels difficult to keep up at times, and it especially doesn't feel good when you do decide to invest resources into skills only for them to get immediately upgraded. And I think the worst part of all of this is both the lack of accessibility and availability for so many of these skills. I think that if IS sees the need to upgrade many of these skills in a short amount of time, then a lot of them should be made easier to get as a result. If something like Potent is considered not good enough on its own, then they should make it more readily available for everybody to obtain. Now, I'm not even necessarily talking about the tier 4 versions, although that would be really great. It could just be the tier 3 versions by putting them in the Grail shop, or even regular demotes, which, you know, they don't really like doing that, but they definitely could. And at least with the Grail system, it would at least encourage more people to go and play modes like Aetherites if they want to obtain the resources necessary to grab them, and then it would become a more feasible cycle where people would invest into the mode, get stuff in return, and then people would keep investing more and more. I think that's a totally valid way to do it. It wouldn't even directly address the overall point, but it would definitely make it feel a lot better for a lot of people, including myself. Especially if they feel as if these newer skills need an upgrade, what's the harm in putting the prerequisites in the free-to-play pool? Of course, I don't expect that to happen anytime soon, if ever. Last year, we've only started getting free-to-play dodge skills on Grails and Demotes long after they've been buried 6 feet under and rendered completely useless, so expecting them to give us something remotely decent definitely feels out of the equation. Still, I really see no reason why they couldn't give us something usable. Even Attack Speed Finish 3, a skill that has been out for years, mind you, literal years, is still not easy to get. I wonder if part of the reason they do this is because it could potentially offset the decreasing incentives for plus 10ing units. That's been a whole issue of its own for a while, since IS really devalued plus 10ing units in general. Everybody can kind of just function at +0 or +1 out of the gate, especially with a newer kit. It's very easy for anybody to also just get a single copy or a +1 of a unit, but the difference between that and somebody going out of their way to get a max amount of merges on a unit is staggering for profits, as those make up a huge portion of their revenue. Even if you think they are really common, usually they're +0 or +1 most of the time, with, you know, very rare occasion of a whale having +10, but that's also just because they're really easy to get for every single player. Although the difference between getting an additional unit for fodder might make up 1 to 2 extra copies at most, which, you know, is still not bad, but that's compared to 9 to 10 additional copies for a +10 unit, which is still a large gap. So maybe that's why they're constantly printing new skills and upgrades to make up for that deficit. It's really hard to say, but that's kind of my working theory at the moment. But if they're not going to change their minds on whatever they're doing with skill stuff, then I would just like more breathing room between skills, because rather than it incentivizing me to go out and get the newer variants, I just end up skipping a lot more stuff, because who's to say there won't be a better version of that same skill in 2 months? And I don't think I'm alone in this mindset, but again, it's really hard to say how much this will affect them down the line, although it's not like they couldn't slow down either, because there's still a lot of skills that people still really like and are perfectly fine. Just look at Attack Speed Excel. It gets printed on nearly every single banner with no altercations, and it's still considered a very, very coveted skill. There are a lot of skills that people would still consider to be very strong, and I guarantee that people would still be fine with them reprinting them more before moving on to newer stuff. In fact, I think they'd probably like that more. You know, assuming it's reasonably paced, I think people would still be fine with it. But they probably also do this because they think it's in their best interest, and honestly, that might be the case. We only know so much about how this game operates and performs, and they have a scarily high amount of data from everybody that plays, so it's very possible that this is just working out for them more than we think. So maybe slowing down and attempting a different strategy would cost them more than, you know, what they're currently doing. Of course, that's complete conjecture on both sides of the discussion because, again, we really just don't know nearly as much as they do, but I feel like at some point, it's just going to give out. That said, it is definitely worth mentioning that when it comes to the general responses with banners not having anything noteworthy or strong, it tends to encourage IS to release stronger stuff anyway, since in the end, people really do care about power creep more than they let on. It's the release of newer skills like these and stronger units as a whole that keep pushing banner sales. Even if it's not as consistent from banner to banner, you could just look at the legendary banner sales alone to see how that's the case. Legendary Sakura didn't really perform well, but she's still one of the strongest units in the game currently. And it is also how the game attempts to stay fresh as often as it can. And you know, that's just the natural state of things, aka basically every gacha ever released. But it's because of that that it will most likely not get any better anytime soon, or at all for that matter. So we should probably just get used to it because there's a good chance it'll only increase later this year. Except for skills like Momentum. Clearly that skill is too good to upgrade or print on anybody else besides Emblem Sigurd. And yeah, you know, I don't know. I really don't know. It would be really nice to have some more breathing room between upgrades. It really hasn't felt all that great seeing newer and newer skills get released in such a short amount of time. That, or they at least throw us some more bones for free-to-play stuff so that it's a lot more manageable in the end. Or even better, they start printing more skills locked to one unit. I need more momentum in my life, IS, please.
I am Sigurd,